James Joseph Brown, May 3, 1933 to December 25, 2006, was an American singer, dancer, and musician. Early life. Brown was born on May 3, 1933, in Barnwell, South Carolina, to 16-year-old Susie née Bailing, 1917 to 2004, and 21-year-old Joseph Gardner Brown, 1912 to 1993, in a small wooden shack. Brown's name was supposed to have been Joseph James Brown, but his first and middle names were mistakenly reversed on his birth certificate. In his autobiography, Brown stated that his father was of mixed African American and Native American descent, while his mother was of mixed African American and Asian descent. The Brown family lived in poverty in Elko, South Carolina, which was an impoverished town in 1933. They moved to Augusta, Georgia, when James was 4 or 5. His family first settled at one of his aunt's brothels. They later moved into a house shared with another aunt. Brown's mother eventually left the family after a contentious and abusive marriage and moved to New York. He began singing in talent shows as a young child, first appearing at Augusta's Lenox Theatre in 1944, winning the show after singing the ballad So Long. While in Augusta, Brown performed buck dances for change to entertain troops from Camp Gordon at the start of World War II as their convoys traveled over a canal bridge near his aunt's home. This is where he first heard the legendary blues musician Howlin' Wolf play guitar. He learned to play the piano, guitar, and harmonica during this period. He became inspired to become an entertainer after hearing Caledonia by Louis Jordan and his Timpani 5. In his teen years, Brown briefly had a career as a boxer. At the age of 16, he was convicted of robbery and sent to a juvenile detention center in Toccoa. There, he formed a gospel quartet with 4 fellow cellmates, including Johnny Terry. Brown met singer Bobby Bird when the two played against each other in a baseball game outside the detention center. Bird discovered that Brown could sing after hearing of A Guy Called Music Box, which was Brown's nickname at the prison. Bird has since said he and his family helped to secure an early release, which led to Brown promising the court he would sing for the Lord. Brown was released on a work sponsorship with Toccoa business owner S.C. Lawson. Lawson was impressed with Brown's work ethic and secured his release with a promise to keep him employed for 2 years. Brown was paroled on June 14, 1952. Brown went on to work with both of Lawson's sons and came back to visit the family from time to time throughout his career. Shortly after being paroled, he joined the gospel group the Ever Ready Gospel Singers, featuring Bird's sister Sarah. Personal life. In 1962, Tammy Terrell joined the James Brown Revue. Brown became sexually involved with Terrell even though she was only 17 inches, a relationship that continued until she escaped his physical abuse. Bobby Bennett, former member of the famous Flames, told Rolling Stone about the abuse he witnessed. "He beat Tammy Terrell terrible," said Bennett. "She was bleeding, shedding blood." Terrell, who died in 1970, was Brown's girlfriend before she became famous as Marvin Gaye's singing partner in the mid-1960s. "Tammy left him because she didn't want her butt whipped," said Bennett, who also claimed he saw Brown kick one pregnant girlfriend down a flight of stairs. Marriages and children. Brown was married 3 times. His first marriage was to Velma Warren in 1953. They had 1 son together. Over a decade later, the couple had separated. They divorced in 1969. They maintained a close friendship that lasted until Brown's death. Brown's second marriage was to Deidre "Dee Dee" Jenkins on October 22, 1970. They had 2 daughters together. In 1974, they separated after what his daughter describes as years of domestic abuse. They divorced on January 10, 1981. His third marriage was to Adrienne Lois Rodriguez, March 9, 1950 to January 6, 1996, in 1984. It was a contentious marriage that made headlines due to domestic abuse complaints. Rodriguez filed for divorce in 1988, citing years of cruelty treatment, but they reconciled. Rodriguez died in 1996. Less than a year later, Brown hired Tommy Ray Heine to be a background singer for his band. She later claimed that she was his 4th wife. On December 23, 2002, Brown, 69, and Heine, 33, held a wedding ceremony that was officiated by the Reverend Larry Flyer. Following Brown's death, controversy surrounded the circumstances of the marriage. Brown's attorney, Albert "Buddy" Dallas, reported that the marriage was not valid. Heine was still married to Javed Ahmed, a man from Bangladesh. Heine claimed Ahmed married her to obtain residency through a green card, and that the marriage was annulled, but the annulment did not occur until April 2004. In an attempt to prove her marriage to Brown was valid, she provided a marriage certificate as proof of her marriage to Brown during an interview on CNN with Larry King, but she did not provide King with court records pointing to an annulment of her marriage to Brown or to Ahmed. According to Dallas, Brown was angry and hurt that Heine had concealed her prior marriage from him, and Brown moved to file for annulment from Heine. Dallas added that though Heine's marriage to Ahmed was annulled after she married Brown, the Brown-Heine marriage was not valid under South Carolina law because Brown and Heine did not remarry after the annulment. In August 2003, Brown took out a full-page public notice in Variety featuring Heine, James II, and himself on vacation at Disney World to announce that he and Heine were going their separate ways. On January 27, 2015, a judge ruled Heine as Brown's legal widow and that she was now Brown's widow for the purpose of determining the distribution of Brown's estate. The decision was based on the grounds that Heine's previous marriage was invalid and that James Brown had abandoned his efforts to annul his own marriage to Heine. On June 17, 2020, a South Carolina Supreme Court ruled that Heine was not legally married to Brown due to her failure to annul her previous marriage. The court ruled that she had no right to any part of his estate. Brown had numerous children. He acknowledged 11 of them, including 5 sons: Teddy, 1954 to 1973, Terry, Larry, Michael Brown, and James Joseph Brown Jr., and 6 daughters: LaRonda Pettit, Dr. Yamanoyola Brown Lumar, Deanna Brown Thomas, Cinnamon Brown, Jeanette Bellinger, and Venetia Brown, 1964 to 2018. Brown had 8 grandchildren and 4 great-grandchildren. Brown's eldest son, Teddy, died in a car crash on June 14, 1973. According to an August 2007 article in the British newspaper The Daily Telegraph, DNA tests indicate that Brown also fathered at least 3 extramarital children. The first one of them to be identified is LaRonda Pettit, born 1962, a retired flight attendant and teacher who lives in Houston. Another alleged son, Michael Dion Brown, was born in September 1968 to Mary Florence Brown. Despite pleading no contest to a paternity suit brought against him in 1983, Brown never officially acknowledged Michael as his son. During contesting of Brown's will, another of the Brown family attorneys, Deborah Opry, revealed to Larry King that James Brown wanted a DNA test performed after his death to confirm the paternity of James Brown Jr., born 2001. Not for Brown Jr.'s sake, but for the sake of the other family members. In April 2007, Heine selected a guardian ad litem whom she wanted the court to appoint to represent her son, James Brown Jr., in the paternity proceedings. James Brown Jr. was confirmed to be his biological son. Music career: 1954 to 1961, The Famous Flames. Main article: The Famous Flames. Brown joined Bobby Byrd's group in 1954. The group had evolved from the Gospel Starlightas, an a cappella gospel group, to an R&B group with the name The Avons. He reputedly joined the band after one of its members, Troy Collins, died in a car crash, along with Brown and Byrd. The group consisted of Sylvester Keels, Doyle Oglesby, Fred Pulliam, Nash Knox, and Floyd Scott. Influenced by R&B groups such as Hank Ballard and the Midnighters, the Orioles, and Billy Ward and his Dominoes, the group changed its name, first to the Toccoa Band and then to the Flames. Floyd's brother Barrowy later joined the group on bass guitar. Brown, Byrd, and Keels switched lead positions and instruments, often playing drums and piano. Johnny Terry later joined, by which time Pulliam and Oglesby had long left. Barry Trimier became the group's first manager, booking them at parties near college campuses in Georgia and South Carolina. The group had already gained a reputation as a good live act when they renamed themselves The Famous Flames. In 1955, the group contacted Little Richard while performing in Macon. Richard convinced the group to get in contact with his manager at the time, Clint Brantley, at his nightclub. Brantley agreed to manage them after seeing the group auditioned. He then sent them to a local radio station to record a demo session where they performed their own composition Please, 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 which was inspired when Little Richard wrote the words of the title on a napkin and Brown was determined to make a song out of it. The Famous Flames eventually signed with King Records' federal subsidiary in Cincinnati, Ohio, and issued a re-recorded version of Please, Please, Please in March 1956. The song became the group's first R&B hit, selling over 1 million copies. None of their follow-ups gained similar success. In 1957, Brown replaced Clint Brantley as manager and hired Ben Bart, chief of Universal Attractions Agency. In 1957, the original Flames broke up, after Bart changed the name of the group to James Brown and his Famous Flames. In October 1958, Brown released the ballad Try Me, which hit #1 on the R&B chart in the beginning of 1959, becoming the first of 17 chart-topping R&B hits. Shortly afterwards, he recruited his first band, led by J.C. Davis, and reunited with Bobby Byrd, who joined a revived Famous Flames lineup that included Eugene Baby, Lloyd Stallworth and Bobby Bennett, with Johnny Terry sometimes coming in as the fifth flame. Brown, the Flames, and his entire band debuted at the Apollo Theater on April 24, 1959, opening for Brown's idol, Little Willie John. Federal Records issued 2 albums credited to Brown and the Famous Flames. Both contained previously released singles. In 1960, Brown began multitasking in the recording studio involving himself, his singing group, the Famous Flames, and his band, a separate entity from the Flames, sometimes named the James Brown Orchestra or the James Brown Band. In 1960, the band released the top 10 R&B hit, Do the Mashed Potatoes on Dade Records, owned by Henry Stone, billed under the pseudonym Nat Kendrick and the Swans due to label issues. As a result of its success, King president Sid Nathan shifted Brown's contract from Federal to the parent label, King, which according to Brown in his autobiography meant you got more support from the company. While with King, Brown, under the Famous Flames lineup, released the hit-filled album Think. And in 1961 released 2 albums with the James Brown Band, earning second billing. With the Famous Flames, Brown sang lead on several more hits, including Bewildered, I'll Go Crazy and Think, songs that hinted at his emerging style. 1962 to 1966, Mr. Dynamite. In 1962, Brown and his band scored a hit with their cover of the instrumental Night Train, becoming a top 5 R&B single. That same year, the ballads Lost Someone and Baby You're Right, the latter a Joe Tex composition, added to his repertoire and increased his reputation with R&B audiences. On October 24, 1962, Brown financed a live recording of a performance at the Apollo and convinced Sid Nathan to release the album, despite Nathan's belief that no one would buy a live album due to the fact that Brown's singles had already been bought and that live albums were usually bad sellers. Brown, middle, and the Famous Flames, far left to right, Bobby Bennett, Lloyd Stallworth, and Bobby Byrd, performing live at the Apollo Theater in New York City, 1964. Live at the Apollo was released in June 1963 and became an immediate hit, eventually reaching #2 on the top LPs chart and selling over 1 million copies, staying on the charts for 14 months. In 1963, Brown scored his first top 20 pop hit with his rendition of the standard Prisoner of Love. He launched his first label, Try Me Records, which included recordings by Tammy Montgomery, later to be famous as Tammy Terrell, Johnny and Bill, Famous Flames associates Johnny Terry and Bill Hollings, and The Poets, which was another name used for Brown's backing band. During this time, Brown began an ill-fated 2-year relationship with 17-year-old Tammy Terrell when she sang in his review. Terrell ended their personal and professional relationship because of Brown's abusive behavior. In 1964, seeking bigger commercial success, Brown and Bobby Byrd formed the production company, Fair Deal, linking the operation to the Mercury imprint, Smash Records. King Records fought against this and was granted an injunction preventing Brown from releasing any recordings for the label. Prior to the injunction, Brown had released 3 vocal singles, including the blues-oriented hit Out of Sight, which further indicated the direction his music was going to take. Touring throughout the year, Brown and the Famous Flames grabbed more national attention after delivering an explosive show-stopping performance on the live concert film The TMI Show. The Flames' dynamic gospel-tinged vocals, polished choreography and timing, as well as Brown's energetic dance moves and high-octane singing upstaged the proposed closing act, The Rolling Stones. Having signed a new deal with King, Brown released his song Papa's Got a Brand New Bag in 1965, which became his first top 10 pop hit and won him his first Grammy Award. Brown signed a production deal with Loma Records. Later, in 1965, he issued I Got You, which became his second single in a row to reach #1 on the R&B chart and top 10 on the pop chart. Brown followed that up with the ballad It's a Man's World, a third top 10 pop hit, #1 R&B, which confirmed his stance as a top-ranking performer, especially with R&B audiences from that point on. 1967 to 1970, Soul Brother #1. Brown performing in 1969. By 1967, Brown's emerging sound began to be defined as funk music. That year he released what some critics cited as the first true funk song, Cold Sweat, which hit #1 on the R&B chart, Top 10 Pop, and became one of his first recordings to contain a drum break and also the first that featured a harmony that was reduced to a single chord. The instrumental arrangements on tracks such as Give It Up or Turn It Loose and Licking Stick, both recorded in 1968, and Funky Drummer, recorded in 1969, featured a more developed version of Brown's mid-1960s style, with the horn section, guitars, bass and drums meshed together in intricate rhythmic patterns based on multiple interlocking riffs. Note, it is very important to mention I've Got Money, which features the first rhythmic shift as one of the foundations of the funk, played by Clayton Filio and recorded in 1961, released in 1962. Changes in Brown's style that started with Cold Sweat established the musical foundation for Brown's later hits, such as I Got the Feelin', 1968, and Mother Popcorn, 1969. By this time Brown's vocals frequently took the form of a kind of rhythmic declamation, not quite sung but not quite spoken, that only intermittently featured traces of pitch or melody. This became a major influence on the techniques of rapping, which would come to maturity along with hip-hop music in the coming decades. Brown's style of funk in the late 1960s was based on interlocking syncopated parts, strutting bass lines, syncopated drum patterns, and iconic percussive guitar riffs. The main guitar ostinatos for 1969's Ain't It Funky and Give It Up or Turn It Loose are examples of Brown's refinement of New Orleans funk, irresistibly danceable riffs, stripped down to their rhythmic essence. On both recordings, the tonal structure is bare bones. The pattern of attack points is the emphasis, not the pattern of pitches, as if the guitar were an African drum or idiophone. Alexander Stewart states that this popular feel was passed along from New Orleans through James Brown's music to the popular music of the 1970s. Those same tracks were later resurrected by countless hip-hop musicians from the 1970s onward. As a result, James Brown remains to this day the world's most sampled recording artist. Two tracks that he wrote are synonymous with modern dance, especially with house music, jungle music, and drum and bass music, which were sped up exponentially in the latter two genres. Bring It Up has an Afro-Cuban guajillo-like structure. All three of these guitar riffs are based on an onbeat/offbeat structure. Stewart says that it is different from a timeline, such as clave and tresillo, in that it is not an exact pattern, but more of a loose organizing principle. It was around this time as the musician's popularity increased that he acquired the nickname Soul Brother #1, after failing to win the title King of Soul from Solomon Burke during a Chicago gig 2 years prior. Brown's recordings during this period influenced musicians across the industry, most notably groups such as Sly and the Family Stone, Funkadelic, Charles Wright and the Watts 103rd Street Rhythm Band, Booker T, and the M.G.S., as well as vocalists such as Edwin Starr, David Ruffin, and Dennis Edwards from The Temptations, and Michael Jackson, who, throughout his career, cited Brown as his ultimate idol. Brown's band during this period employed musicians and arrangers who had come up through the jazz tradition. He was noted for his ability as a bandleader and songwriter to blend the simplicity and drive of R&B with the rhythmic complexity and precision of jazz. Trumpeter Lewis Hamlin and saxophonist/keyboardist Alfred Pee Wee Ellis, the successor to previous bandleader Nat Jones, led the band. Guitarist Jimmy Nolan provided percussive, deceptively simple riffs for each song, and Maceo Parker's prominent saxophone solos provided a focal point for many performances. Other members of Brown's band included stalwart Famous Flames singer and sideman Bobby Bird, trombonist Fred Wesley, drummers John Jabo Starks, Clyde Stubblefield and Melvin Parker, saxophonist St. Clair Pinckney, guitarist Alfonso Country Kellum and bassist Bernard Odom. In addition to a torrent of singles and studio albums, Brown's output during this period included two more successful live albums, Live at the Garden, 1967, and Live at the Apollo, Volume 2, 1968, and a 1968 television special, James Brown, Man to Man. His music empire expanded along with his influence on the music scene. As Brown's music empire grew, his desire for financial and artistic independence grew as well. Brown bought radio stations during the late 1960s, including WRDW in his native Augusta, where he shined shoes as a boy. In November 1967, James Brown purchased radio station WGYW in Knoxville, Tennessee, for a reported $75,000, according to the January 20, 1968 Record World magazine. The call letters were changed to WGB, reflecting his initials. WGB began on January 15, 1968, and broadcast a rhythm and blues format. The station's slogan was WGB 1430 Raw Soul. Brown bought Webb in Baltimore in 1970. Brown branched out to make several recordings with musicians outside his own band. In an attempt to appeal to the older, more affluent, and predominantly white adult contemporary audience, Brown recorded Gettin' Down to It, 1969, and Soul on Top, 1970, two albums consisting mostly of romantic ballads, jazz standards, and homologous reinterpretations of his earlier hits with the DeFelice Trio and the Louis Bellson Orchestra. In 1968, he recorded a number of funk-oriented tracks with the Daps, a white Cincinnati band, including the hit I Can't Stand Myself. He also released 3 albums of Christmas music with his own band. 1970 to 2006, Godfather of Soul. Main article, The JBs. In March 1970, most of Brown's mid to late 1960s road band walked out on him due to financial disputes, a development augured by the prior disbandment of the famous Flame singing group for the same reason in 1968. Brown and erstwhile famous Flame singer Bobby Bird, who chose to remain in the band during this tumultuous period as co-frontman, effectively serving as a prototype man in live performances, recruited several members of the Pacemakers, a Cincinnati-based ensemble that included bassist Bootsy Collins and his brother, guitarist Phelps Catfish Collins, augmented by the remaining members of the 1960s road band, including Fred Wesley, who rejoined Brown's outfit in December 1970, and other newer musicians. They formed the nucleus of the JBs, Brown's new backing ensemble. Shortly following their first performance together, the band entered the studio to record the Brown Bird composition, Get Up, I Feel Like Being a Sex Machine. The song, with its off-the-beat play Brown called The One and other contemporaneous singles, further cemented Brown's influence in the nascent genre of funk music. This iteration of the JBs dissolved after a March 1971 European tour, documented on the 1991 archival release Love Power Peace, due to additional money disputes and Bootsy Collins' use of LSD. A new lineup of the JBs coalesced around Wesley, St. Clair Pinckney and drummer John Starks. Brown in Tampa, 1972. In 1971, Brown began recording for Polydor Records. Many of his sidemen and supporting players, including Fred Wesley and the JBs, Bobby Bird, Lynn Collins, Vicki Anderson and former rival Hank Ballard, released records on the People label. During the 1972 presidential election, James Brown openly proclaimed his support of Richard Nixon for re-election to the presidency over Democratic candidate George McGovern. The decision led to a boycott of his performances and, according to Brown, cost him a big portion of his black audience. As a result, Brown's record sales and concerts in the United States were in a lull in 1973, as he failed to land a #1 R&B single that year. In 1973, he also faced problems with the IRS for failure to pay back taxes, charging he hadn't paid upwards of $4.5 million. 5 years earlier, the IRS had claimed he owed nearly $2 million. Brown performing, 1973. In 1973, Brown provided the score for the blaxploitation film Black Caesar. In 1974, he returned to the #1 spot on the R&B charts with The Payback, with the parent album reaching the same spot on the album charts. He reached #1 2 more times in 1974, with My Tang and Papa Don't Take No Mess. Papa Don't Take No Mess was his final single to reach the #1 spot on the R&B charts. His other top 10 R&B hits during this latter period included Funky President, R&B No. 4, and Get Up Off of That Thing, R&B No. 4. James Brown, 1977. Although his records were mainstays of the vanguard New York underground disco scene, exemplified by DJs such as David Mancuso and Francis Grasso, from 1969 onwards, Brown did not consciously yield to the trend until 1975's Sex Machine Today. By 1977, he was no longer a dominant force in R&B. After Get Up Offa That Thing, 13 of Brown's late 1970s recordings for Polydor failed to reach the top 10 of the R&B chart, with only Body Heat in 1976 and the disco-oriented It's Too Funky in Here in 1979 reaching the R&B top 15 and the ballad Kiss in 77 reaching the top 20. After 1970 SIX's Body Heat, he failed to appear on the Billboard Hot 100. As a result, Brown's concert attendance began dropping and his reported disputes with the IRS caused his business empire to collapse. In addition, several longtime bandmates, including Wesley and Maceo Parker, had gradually pivoted to Parliament Funkadelic, which reached its critical and commercial apogee in the mid to late 1970s. The emergence of disco forestalled Brown's success on the R&B charts because its slicker, more commercial style had superseded his rawer, one-chord funk productions. By the release of 1979's The Original Disco Man, Brown seldom contributed to the songwriting and production processes, leaving most of it to producer Brad Shapiro. This resulted in the song It's Too Funky in Here becoming Brown's most successful single in this period. After 2 more albums failed to chart, Brown left Polydor in 1981. It was around this time that Brown changed the name of his band from the JBs to the Soul Generals, or Soul G's. The band retained that name until his death. Despite Brown's declining record sales, promoters Gary Loconte and Jim Rismiller helped Brown sell out a string of residency shows at the Reseda Country Club in Los Angeles in early 1982. Brown's compromised commercial standing prevented him from charging a large fee. However, the great success of these shows marked a turning point for Brown's career, and soon he was back on top in Hollywood. Movies followed, including appearances in Dr. Detroit, 1983, and Rocky IV, 1985. He guest starred in the Miami Vice episode Missing Hours, 1987. Previously, Brown appeared alongside a litany of other black musical luminaries in The Blues Brothers, 1980. In 1984, he teamed with rap musician Afrika Bambaataa on the song Unity. A year later he signed with Scotti Brothers Records and issued the moderately successful album Gravity in 1986 with the popular song How Do You Stop? It included Brown's final top 10 pop hit, Living in America, marking his first top 40 entry since 1974 and his first top 10 pop entry since 1968. Produced and written by Dan Hartman, it featured prominently on the Rocky IV film and soundtrack. Brown performed the song in the film at Apollo Creed's final fight, shot in the Ziegfeld Room at the MGM Grand in Las Vegas, and was credited in the film as the Godfather of Soul. 1986 also saw the publication of his autobiography, James Brown, The Godfather of Soul, co-written with Bruce Tucker. In 1987, Brown won the Grammy for Best Male R&B Vocal Performance for Living in America. In 1988, Brown worked with the production team Full Force on the new Jack Swing-influenced I'm Real. It spawned his final 2 top 10 R&B hits, I'm Real and Static, which peaked at number 2 and number 5, respectively. Meanwhile, the drum break from the second version of the original 1969 hit Give It Up or Turn It Loose, the recording included on the compilation album In the Jungle Groove, became so popular at hip-hop dance parties, especially for breakdance, during the early 1980s that hip-hop pioneer Curtis Blow called the song the national anthem of hip-hop. Brown performing in 1998. After his stint in prison during the late 1980s, Brown met Larry Friday and Thomas Hart, who produced the first James Brown biopic, entitled James Brown, The Man, The Message, The Music, released in 1992. He returned to music with the album Love Overdue in 1991. It included the single, So Tired of Standing Still We Got to Move On, which peaked at number 48 on the R&B chart. His former record label Polydor released the 4-CD box set Star Time, spanning Brown's career to date. Brown's release from prison prompted his former record labels to reissue his albums on CD, featuring additional tracks and commentary by music critics and historians. In 1991, Brown appeared on rapper MC Hammer's video for Too Legit to Quit. Hammer had been noted, alongside Big Daddy Kane, for bringing Brown's unique stage shows and their own energetic dance moves to the hip-hop generation. Both listed Brown as their idol. Both musicians sampled his work, with Hammer having sampled the rhythms from Superbad for his song Here Comes the Hammer, from his best-selling album Please Hammer, Don't Hurt 'Em. Big Daddy Kane sampled many times. Before the year was over, Brown, who had immediately returned to work with his band following his release, organized a pay-per-view concert following a show at Los Angeles' Wiltern Theater that was well received. On June 10, 1991, James Brown and a star-filled lineup performed before a crowd at the Wiltern Theater for a live pay-per-view at-home audience. James Brown, Living in America, Live, was the brainchild of Indiana producer Danny Hubbard. It featured MC Hammer as well as Belle Biv DeVoe, Heavy D and the Boys, En Vogue, C+C Music Factory, Quincy Jones, Sherman Hemsley and Keenan Ivory Wayans. Ice-T, Tone Loc and Kool Moe Dee performed paying homage to Brown. This was Brown's first public performance since his parole from the South Carolina prison system in February. He had served 2.5 years of 2 concurrent 6-year sentences for aggravated assault and other felonies. Brown continued making recordings. In 1993, his album Universal James was released. It included his final Billboard charting single, Can't Get Any Harder, which peaked at number 76 on the US R&B chart and reached number 59 on the UK chart. Its brief charting in the UK was probably due to the success of a remixed version of I Feel Good featuring Dakine. Brown released the singles How Long and Georgelina, which failed to chart. In 1995, Brown returned to the Apollo and recorded live at the Apollo 1995. It included a studio track titled Respect Me, which was released as a single. Again, it failed to chart. Brown during the NBA All-Star Game Jam Session, 2001. Brown's final studio albums, I'm Back and The Next Step, were released in 1998 and 2002 respectively. I'm Back featured the song Funk on Our Roll, which peaked at number 40 in the UK but did not chart in his native US. The Next Step included Brown's final single, Killing Is Out, School Is In. Both albums were produced by Derek Monk. Brown's concert success remained unabated and he kept up with a grueling schedule throughout the remainder of his life, living up to his previous nickname, the hardest working man in show business, in spite of his advanced age. In 2003, Brown participated in the PBS American Masters television documentary James Brown, Soul Survivor, which was directed by Jeremy Marr. Brown performed in the Super Bowl 31 halftime show in 1997. Brown celebrated his status as an icon by appearing in a variety of entertainment and sports events, including an appearance on the WCW pay-per-view event, Super Brawl X, where he danced alongside wrestler Ernest the Cat Miller, who based his character on Brown, during his in-ring skit with the Maestro. Brown appeared in Tony Scott's short film Beat the Devil in 2001. He was featured alongside Clive Owen, Gary Oldman, Danny Trejo, and Marilyn Manson. Brown made a cameo appearance in the 2002 Jackie Chan film The Tuxedo, in which Chan was required to finish Brown's act after having accidentally knocked out the singer. In 2002, Brown appeared in Undercover Brother, playing himself. Brown performing, June 2005. In 2004, Brown opened for the Red Hot Chili Peppers at several Hyde Park concerts in London. The beginning of 2005 saw the publication of his second book, I Feel Good, a memoir of a life of soul, written with Mark Elliott. In February and March 2005, he participated in recording sessions for an intended studio album with Fred Wesley, Pee Wee Ellis, and other longtime collaborators. Though he lost interest in the album, which remains unreleased, a track from the sessions, Gut Bucket, appeared on a compilation CD included with the August 2006 issue of Mojo. He appeared at Edinburgh 50,000, The Final Push, the final Live 8 concert on July 6, 2005, where he performed a duet with British pop star Will Young on Papa's Got a Brand New Bag. In the Black Eyed Peas album Monkey Business, Brown was featured on a track called They Don't Want Music. The previous week, he had performed a duet with another British pop star, Joss Stone, on the United Kingdom chat show Friday Night with Jonathan Ross. In 2006, Brown continued his 7 Decades of Funk World Tour. His final major U.S. performance was in San Francisco on August 20, 2006, as headliner at the Festival of the Golden Gate, Fugfest, on the Great Meadow at Fort Mason. The next day, he performed at an 800-seat campus theater at Humboldt State University in Arcata, California. His last shows were greeted with positive reviews, and one of his final concert appearances at the Irish Oxygen Festival in Punchestown in 2006 included a record crowd of 80,000 people. He played a full concert as part of the BBC's Electric Proms on October 27, 2006, at the Roundhouse, supported by the Zootons, with special appearances from Max Beasley and the Sugababes. Brown's last televised appearance was at his induction into the UK Music Hall of Fame in November 2006, before his death in December. Before his death, Brown had been scheduled to perform a duet with singer Annie Lennox on the song Vengeance for her new album Venus, which was released in 2007. Artistry. Brown's most famous MC was Danny Ray, Center, who was with him for over 30 years. As a vocalist, Brown performed in a forceful shout style derived from gospel music. Meanwhile, his rhythmic grunts and expressive shrieks harked back farther still to ring shouts, work songs, and field cries. According to the Encyclopedia of African American Culture and History, 1996, he re-imported the rhythmic complexity from which rhythm and blues, under the dual pressure of rock and roll and pop, had progressively fallen away since its birth from jazz and blues. For many years, Brown's touring show was one of the most extravagant productions in American popular music. At the time of Brown's death, his band included 3 guitarists, 2 bass guitar players, 2 drummers, 3 horns, and a percussionist. The bands that he maintained during the late 1960s and 1970s were of comparable size, and the bands also included a 3-piece amplified string section that played during the ballads. Brown employed between 40 and 50 people for the James Brown Revue, and members of the Revue traveled with him in a bus to cities and towns all over the country, performing upwards of 330 shows a year, with almost all of the shows as one-nighters. Concert style. Before James Brown appeared on stage, his personal MC gave him an elaborate introduction accompanied by drumrolls, as the MC worked in Brown's various sobriquets along with the names of many of his hit songs. The introduction by Fats Gonder, captured on Brown's 1963 album Live at the Apollo, is a representative example. So now, ladies and gentlemen, it is star time. Are you ready for star time? Thank you, and thank you very kindly. It is indeed a great pleasure to present to you at this particular time, national, LY, and international, LY, known as the hardest working man in show business, the man that sings I'll go crazy, try me, you've got the power, think, if you want me, I don't mind, bewildered, the $1 million seller, lost someone, the very latest release, Night Train, lets everybody shout and shimmy. Mr. Dynamite, the amazing Mr. Please Please himself, the star of the show, James Brown and the famous Flames. Brown and MC Danny Ray during Cape Routine, BBC Electric Proms '06 concert. James Brown's performances were famous for their intensity and length. His own stated goal was to give people more than what they came for, make them tired, 'cause that's what they came for. Brown's concert repertoire consisted mostly of his own hits and recent songs, with a few R&B covers mixed in. Brown danced vigorously as he sang, working popular dance steps such as the mashed potato into his routine along with dramatic leaps, splits and slides. His horn players and singing group, the famous Flames, typically performed choreographed dance routines, and later incarnations of the Revue included backup dancers. Male performers in the Revue were required to wear tuxedos and cummerbunds long after more casual concert wear became the norm among the younger musical acts. Brown's own extravagant outfits and his elaborate processed hairdo completed the visual impression. A James Brown concert typically included a performance by a featured vocalist, such as Vicki Anderson or Marva Whitney, and an instrumental feature for the band, which sometimes served as the opening act for the show. A trademark feature of Brown's stage shows, usually during the song Please, 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 involved Brown dropping to his knees while clutching the microphone stand in his hands, prompting the show's longtime MC, Danny Ray, to come out, drape a cape over Brown's shoulders and escort him off the stage after he had worked himself to exhaustion during his performance. As Brown was escorted off the stage by the MC, Brown's vocal group, the famous Flames, Bobby Bird, Lloyd Stallworth, and Bobby Bennett, continued singing the background vocals Please, Please Don't Go. Brown would then shake off the cape and stagger back to the microphone to perform an encore. Brown's routine was inspired by a similar one used by the professional wrestler Gorgeous George, as well as Little Richard. In his 2005 autobiography I Feel Good, a memoir in a life of soul, Brown, who is a fan of Gorgeous George, credited the wrestler as the inspiration for both his cape routine and concert attire, stating, "Seeing him on TV helped create the James Brown you see on stage." Brown performs a version of the cape routine in the film of the TMI show, 1964. in which he and the Famous Flames upstaged the Rolling Stones, and over the closing credits of the film Blues Brothers 2000. The Police referred to James Brown on the TMI show in their 1980 song When the World is Running Down, "You make the best of what's still around." Band leadership. Brown demanded extreme discipline, perfection, and precision from his musicians and dancers. Performers in his review showed up for rehearsals and members wore the right uniform or costume for concert performances. During an interview conducted by Terry Gross during the NPR segment Fresh Air with Maceo Parker, a former saxophonist in Brown's band for most of the 1960s and part of the 1970s and 1980s, Parker offered his experience with the discipline that Brown demanded of the band. "You gotta be on time. You gotta have your uniform. Your stuff's got to be intact. You gotta have the bow tie. You got to have it. You can't come up without the bow tie. You cannot come up without a cummerbund. The patent leather shoes we were wearing at the time gotta be greased. You just gotta have this stuff." This is what Brown expected. Brown bought the costumes. He bought the shoes. And if for some reason the band member decided to leave the group, Brown told the person to, "Please leave my uniforms." Maceo Parker. Brown also had a practice of directing, correcting, and assessing fines on members of his band who broke his rules, such as wearing unshined shoes, dancing out of sync, or showing up late on stage. During some of his concert performances, Brown danced in front of his band with his back to the audience as he slid across the floor, flashing hand signals and splaying his pulsating fingers to the beat of the music. Although audiences thought Brown's dance routine was part of his act, this practice was actually his way of pointing to the offending member of his troupe who played or sang the wrong note or committed some other infraction. Brown used his splayed fingers and hand signals to alert the offending person of the fine that person must pay to him for breaking his rules. Brown's demands on his support acts could be harsh. As Fred Wesley recalled of his time as musical director of the JBs, if Brown felt intimidated by a support act, he would try to undermine their performances by shortening their sets without notice, demanding that they not do certain show-stopping songs, and even insisting on doing the unthinkable, playing drums on some of their songs. A sure set killer. Social activism. Education advocacy and humanitarianism. Brown's main social activism was in preserving the need for education among youths, influenced by his own troubled childhood and his being forced to drop out of the 7th grade for wearing insufficient clothes. Due to heavy dropout rates in the 1960s, Brown released the pro-education song, "Don't Be a Dropout." Royalties of the song were donated to dropout prevention charity programs. The success of this led to Brown meeting with President Lyndon B. Johnson at the White House. Johnson cited Brown for being a positive role model to the youth. In 1968, James Brown endorsed Hubert Humphrey. Later, Brown gained the confidence of President Richard Nixon, to whom he found he had to explain the plight of Black Americans. Throughout the remainder of his life, Brown made public speeches in schools and continued to advocate the importance of education in school. Upon filing his will in 2002, Brown advised that most of the money in his estate go into creating the I Feel Good Incorporated Trust to benefit disadvantaged children and provide scholarships for his grandchildren. His final single, "Killing Is Out, School Is In," advocated against murders of young children in the streets. Brown often gave out money and other items to children while traveling to his childhood hometown of Augusta. A week before his death, while looking gravely ill, Brown gave out toys and turkeys to kids at an Atlanta orphanage, something he had done several times over the years. Civil rights and self-reliance. Though Brown performed at benefit rallies for civil rights organizations in the mid-1960s, Brown often shied away from discussing civil rights in his songs in fear of alienating his crossover audience. In 1968, in response to a growing urge of anti-war advocacy during the Vietnam War, Brown recorded the song, "America Is My Home." In the song, Brown performed a rap advocating patriotism and exhorting listeners to stop pitying yourselves and get up and fight. At the time of the song's release, Brown had been performing for troops stationed in Vietnam. The Boston Garden Concert. On April 5, 1968, a day after the assassination of Martin Luther King, Jr. in Memphis, Tennessee, Brown provided a free citywide televised concert at the Boston Garden to maintain public order and calm concerned Boston residents over the objections of the police chief, who wanted to call off the concert, which he thought would incite violence. The show was later released on DVD as Live at the Boston Garden, April 5, 1968. According to the documentary The Night James Brown Saved Boston, then Mayor Kevin White had strongly restrained the Boston police from cracking down on minor violence and protests after the assassination, while religious and community leaders worked to keep tempers from flaring. White arranged to have Brown's performance broadcast multiple times on Boston's public television station, WGBH, thus keeping potential rioters off the streets, watching the concert for free. Angered by not being told of this, Brown demanded $60,000 for gate fees, money he thought would be lost from ticket sales on account of the concert being broadcast for free, and then threatened to go public about the secret arrangement when the city balked at paying up afterwards, news of which would have been a political death blow to White and spark riots of its own. White eventually lobbied a behind-the-scenes power brokering group known as the Vault to come up with money for Brown's gate fee and other social programs, contributing $100,000. Brown received $15,000 from them via the city. White also persuaded management at the Garden to give up their share of receipts to make up the differences. Following this successful performance, Brown was counseled by President Johnson to urge cities ravaged from riots following King's assassination to not resort to violence, telling them to cool it, there's another way. Responding to pressure from black activists, including H. Rap Brown, to take a bigger stance on their issues and from footage of black-on-black crime committed in inner cities, Brown wrote the lyrics to the song Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud, which his bandleader Alfred Pee Wee Ellis accompanied with a musical composition. Released late that summer, the song's lyrics helped to make it an anthem for the civil rights movement. Brown only performed the song sporadically following its initial release, and later stated he had regrets about recording it, saying in 1984, Now Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud has done more for the black race than any other record, but if I had my choice, I wouldn't have done it, because I don't like defining anyone by race. To teach race is to teach separatism. In his autobiography he stated, The song is obsolete now. But it was necessary to teach pride then, and I think the song did a lot of good for a lot of people. People called Black and Proud militant and angry, maybe because of the line about dying on your feet instead of living on your knees. But really, if you listen to it, it sounds like a children's song. That's why I had children in it, so children who heard it could grow up feeling pride. The song cost me a lot of my crossover audience. The racial makeup at my concerts was mostly black after that. I don't regret it, though, even if it was misunderstood. In 1969, Brown recorded 2 more songs of social commentary, World and I Don't Want Nobody to Give Me Nothing, the latter song pleading for equal opportunity and self-reliance rather than entitlement. In 1970, in response to some black leaders for not being outspoken enough, he recorded Get Up, Get Into It, Get Involved and Talkin' Loud and Sayin' Nothing. In 1971, he began touring Africa, including Zambia and Nigeria. He was made Freeman of the City in Lagos, Nigeria, by Oba Adeyinka Oyekan for his influence on black people all over the world. With his company, James Brown Enterprises, Brown helped to provide jobs for blacks in business in the communities. As the 1970s continued, Brown continued to record songs of social commentary, most prominently 1972's King Heroin and the 2-part ballad Public Enemy, which dealt with drug addiction. Political views. During the 1968 presidential campaign, Brown endorsed Democratic presidential candidate Hubert Humphrey and appeared with Humphrey at political rallies. Brown was labeled an Uncle Tom for supporting Humphrey and also for releasing the pro-American funk song, America Is My Home, in which Brown had lambasted protesters of the Vietnam War as well as the politics of pro-black activists. Brown began supporting Republican President Richard Nixon after being invited to perform at Nixon's inaugural ball in January 1969. Brown's endorsement of Nixon's campaign during the 1972 presidential election negatively impacted his career during that period, with several national black organizations boycotting his records and protesting at his concert shows. A November 1972 show in Cincinnati was picketed with signs saying, "James Brown, Nixon's Clown." Brown initially was invited to perform at a youth concert following Nixon's inauguration in January 1973 but bailed out due to the backlash he suffered from supporting Nixon. Brown joined fellow black entertainer Sammy Davis Jr., who faced similar backlash, to back out of the concert. Brown blamed it on fatigue. Brown later reversed his support of Nixon and composed the song, "You Can Have Watergate, Just Gimme Some Bucks and I'll Be Straight," as a result. After Nixon resigned from office, Brown composed the 1974 hit, "Funky President, People It's Bad," right after Gerald Ford took Nixon's place. Brown later supported Democratic President Jimmy Carter, attending one of Carter's inaugural balls in 1977. Brown openly supported President Ronald Reagan's re-election in 1984. Brown stated he was neither Democratic nor Republican despite his support of Republican presidents such as Nixon and Reagan, as well as Democratic presidents John F. Kennedy, Lyndon B. Johnson, and Jimmy Carter. In 1999, when being interviewed by Rolling Stone, the magazine asked him to name a hero in the 20th century. Brown mentioned John F. Kennedy and then 96-year-old U.S. Senator and former Dixiecrat, Strom Thurmond, stating, "When the young whippersnappers get out of line, whether Democratic or Republican, an old man can walk up and say, 'Wait a minute, son, it goes this way.' And that's great for our country. He's like a grandfather to me." In 2003, Brown was the featured attraction of a Washington, D.C. fundraiser for the National Republican Senatorial Committee. Following the deaths of Ronald Reagan and his friend Ray Charles, Brown said to CNN, "I'm kind of in an uproar. I love the country and I've been around a long time, through many presidents and everything. So after losing Mr. Reagan, who I knew very well, then Mr. Ray Charles, who I worked with and lived with like all our life, we had a show together in Oakland many, many years ago, and it's like you found the placard." Despite his contrarian political views, Brown mentored black activist Reverend Al Sharpton during the 1970s. Drug abuse. For most of his career, Brown had a strict drug and alcohol-free policy for any member in his entourage, including band members. He would fire people who disobeyed orders, particularly those who used or abused drugs. Although early members of the famous Flames were fired for using alcohol, Brown often served a highball consisting of Delaware Punch and moonshine at his St. Albans, Queens, house in the mid-1960s. Some of the original members of Brown's 1970s band, the JBs, including Catfish and Bootsy Collins, intentionally took LSD during a performance in 1971, causing Brown to fire them after the show because he had suspected them of being on drugs all along. Aide Bob Patton has asserted that he accidentally shared a PCP-laced cannabis joint with Brown in the mid-1970s and hallucinated for hours, although Brown talked about it as if it was only marijuana he was smoking. By the mid-1980s, it was widely alleged that Brown was using drugs, with Vicki Anderson confirming to journalist Barney Hoskins that Brown's regular use of PCP, colloquially known as angel dust, began before 1982. After he met and later married Adrienne Rodriguez in 1984, she and Brown began using PCP together. This drug usage often resulted in violent outbursts from him, and he was arrested several times for domestic violence against Rodriguez while high on the drug. By January 1988, Brown faced 4 criminal charges within a 12-month span relating to driving, PCP, and gun possession. After an April 1988 arrest for domestic abuse, Brown went on the CNN program Sonia Live in L.A. with host Sonia Friedman. The interview became notorious for Brown's irreverent demeanor, with some asserting that Brown was high. One of Brown's former mistresses recalled in a GQ magazine article about Brown, some years after his death, that Brown would smoke PCP until that got hard to find, and cocaine, mixed with tobacco in cool cigarettes. He engaged in the off-label use of sildenafil, maintaining that it gave him extra energy. Once, while traveling in a car under the influence of PCP, which he continued to procure dependent on its availability, Brown alleged that passing trees contained psychotronic surveillance technology. In January 1998, he spent a week in rehab to deal with an addiction to unspecified prescription drugs. A week after his release, he was arrested for an unlawful use of a handgun and possession of cannabis. Prior to his death in December 2006, traces of cocaine were found in the singer's urine. When Brown entered Emory University Hospital, his widow suggested Brown would do crack with a female acquaintance. Legal issues. Theft and assault convictions. Brown's personal life was marred by numerous brushes with the law. At the age of 16, he was convicted of theft and served 3 years in juvenile prison. In 1963, during a concert held at Club 15 in Macon, Georgia, while Otis Redding was performing alongside his former band Johnny Jenkins and the Pinetoppers, Brown, reportedly wielding 2 shotguns, tried to shoot his musical rival Joe Texas. The incident led to multiple people being shot and stabbed. Since Brown was still on parole at the time, he relied on his agent Clint Brantley and a few $1,000s to make the situation disappear. According to Jenkins, 7 people got shot, and after the shootout ended, a man appeared and gave each one of the injured $100 apiece, not to carry it no further and not to talk to the press. Brown was never charged for the incident. On July 16, 1978, after performing at the Apollo, Brown was arrested for reportedly failing to turn in records from one of his radio stations after the station was forced to file for bankruptcy. An 8th-generation Ford F-150 single cab, similar to the truck Brown drove during his infamous high-speed chase along the Georgia-South Carolina border in September 1988. Brown was arrested on April 3, 1988, for assault, and again in May 1988 on drug and weapons charges, and again on September 24, 1988, following a high-speed car chase on Interstate 20 near the Georgia-South Carolina state border. He was convicted of carrying an unlicensed pistol and assaulting a police officer, along with various drug-related and driving offenses. He was sentenced to 6 years in prison. He was released on parole on February 27, 1991, after serving 2 years of his sentence. Brown's FBI file, released to the Washington Post in 2007 under the Freedom of Information Act, related Brown's claim that the high-speed chase did not occur as claimed by the police, and that local police shot at his car several times during an incident of police harassment and assaulted him after his arrest. Local authorities found no merit to Brown's accusations. In 1998, a woman named Mary Simons accused Brown in a civil suit of holding her captive for 3 days, demanding oral sex and firing a gun in his office. Simons' charge was eventually dismissed. Another civil suit, filed by former background singer Lisa Rushton, alleged that between 1994 and 1999, Brown allegedly demanded sexual favors, and when refused, would cut off her pay and kept her off stage. She claimed that Brown would place a hand on her buttocks and loudly told her in a crowded restaurant to not look or speak to any other man besides himself. Rushton eventually withdrew her lawsuit. In another civil suit, a woman named Lisa Agbalaya, who worked for Brown, said the singer would tell her he had bull testicles, handed her a pair of zebra-print underwear, told her to wear them while he massaged her with oil, and fired her after she refused. A Los Angeles jury cleared the singer of sexual harassment, but found him liable for wrongful termination. The police were summoned to Brown's residence on July 3, 2000, after he was accused of charging at an electric company repairman with a steak knife. When the repairman visited Brown's house to investigate a complaint about having no lights at the residence. In 2003, Brown was pardoned by the South Carolina Department of Probation, Parole, and Pardon Services for past crimes that he was convicted of committing in South Carolina. Domestic violence arrests. Brown was repeatedly arrested for domestic violence. On 4 occasions between 1987 and 1995, Brown was arrested on charges of assault against his third wife, Adrienne Rodriguez. In one incident, Rodriguez reported to authorities that Brown beat her with an iron pipe and shot at her car. Rodriguez was hospitalized after the last assault in October 1995. Charges were dropped after she died in January 1996. In January 2004, Brown was arrested in South Carolina on a domestic violence charge after Tommy Ray Heine accused him of pushing her to the floor during an argument at their home, where she suffered scratches and bruises to her right arm and hip. In June, Brown pleaded no contest to the domestic violence incident, but served no jail time. Instead, Brown was required to forfeit a $1,087 bond as punishment. Rape accusation. In January 2005, a woman named Jock Hollander filed a lawsuit against James Brown, which stemmed from an alleged 1988 rape. When the case was initially heard before a judge in 2002, Hollander's claims against Brown were dismissed by the court as the limitations period for filing the suit had expired. Hollander claimed that stress from the alleged assault later caused her to develop Graves' disease, a chronic thyroid condition. Hollander claimed that the incident took place in South Carolina while she was employed by Brown as a publicist. Hollander alleged that, during her ride in a van with Brown, Brown pulled over to the side of the road and sexually assaulted her while he threatened her with a shotgun. In her case against Brown, Hollander entered as evidence a DNA sample and a polygraph result. The evidence was not considered due to the limitations defense. Hollander later attempted to bring her case before the Supreme Court, but nothing came of her complaint.